I think we're live. Hello, everybody. Now we're live. It takes a minute or two. We are in the future, just a little bit ahead of you. So happy Friday, everybody. Thanks to so many of you. Now that I've been traveling a lot, I'm running into people around the world, and it's been super exciting to meet people who are like, hey, I catch your LinkedIn Live on Friday. Was invited to speak in the Philippines and do a LinkedIn Live as part of a big live event with leaders across the region. So cool, great to connect with you. And great to connect you today with Alyssa Rosinski, who is the new lead of training at the Future of Privacy Forum. Welcome, Alyssa. Alyssa comes over from helping build the privacy training programs at the IAPP. Training is becoming a bigger part of what we do. We split our time, as many of you know, between a couple of areas. One is how do we help the senior leaders in privacy, whether they are data protection authorities, whether they are chief privacy officers, legal leads, policymakers, people who are serious, who are expert, who are working on legislation, who are working on compliance, who are building programs, who have teams, who have resources. How do we help them support their efforts to think through some of the hardest problems? Over the years, we built out training that we would provide to policymakers with the view that they're the experts on law. They're the experts on figuring out what democratic societies want to do and draw lines, but they're not always the experts on the nuts and bolts of how emerging technologies work. They don't write the code. They're not working on the inside of organizations. Most of us are not. And frankly, during the years when I did work, the best education and training I got wasn't simply doing my job. It was when I sat through some of the training that different product groups had many, many, many years ago. When I first worked for an ed tech company, the best learning I had was sitting down and going through the training that salespeople got. It also helped me understand why there was so much confusion, because I remember coming in and saying, oh, how does this all work? And right away people said, oh, well, it's all anonymous and everything's aggregated. And I'm like, I don't really know that that's the case, but I hear you. And then when I sat through the training, I realized that it was true that the tools that the people who were trafficking ads or handling the nuts and bolts that were dealing with these things in the aggregate. Of course, the underlying data and the processes were dealing with individual data, but some of them, if they were in sales, they weren't learning, the underlying nuts and bolts. All they learned was, well, how do you traffic this, and how do you sell it, and how do you put together these audiences? And they were working with what were aggregated type end results. And so, of course, they were telling anybody who asked, oh, well, we only deal with aggregated data. And the fact that, well, no, your underlying infrastructure deals with unique data, and you're only viewing it in an aggregated way. And it kind of helped me see where they were confusion. So anyway, take a look at some of take a look at some of the underlying technologies is what we would try to put together for policymakers so they could actually understand and not simply hear what policy or government affairs people were telling them. The more they understood just simply how the technology worked, where the data went, how organizations, business, or government was using it, the more effective they were going to be at proposing solutions or regulating or enforcing in a way that I think makes most sense. We found that we had a lot of interest, even though these were being put together for policymakers. We had a lot of interest in industry, and I was a little bit surprised. I said, well, you work in that sector. We're doing this for, maybe somebody junior working for a policymaker who doesn't have experience. But you know what? It turns out people learn their core area pretty well, but it's really hard to learn the adjacent areas. So we talked about ad tech. If you work at a bank, you clearly, hopefully know a lot about the details of how financial institutions use data. Hopefully, you know the laws that are relevant, but you may not know a lot about ad tech because it's not what you do. But yes, guess what? You probably do spend, your organization probably spends a huge amount of money and has all kinds of trackers, and your people, your product people, your sales people are telling you what they think is actually happening, and then you're giving them advice. Well, guess what? The product person at the company selling it only knows the details at a certain level, is maybe on the sales side. They're talking to your people who only know it on your side. And then you're trying to decide whether or not something is personal or what the purpose is. And it's like a game of telephone tag. So super valuable. We learned to do programming that really focused on teaching the nuts and bolts for people who then were going to have to apply policy and law. So we did a number of these classes over the past 2 years. They were very successful. And we realized we need real professional expertise in building out training if we're going to do this in a sophisticated way at scale. And so Alyssa is here and is working on those issues. But I wanted to steal her, not to simply talk about our training, which we'll talk about. And please look at our website for details, because we'd love to have you. But we jointly started exploring, what is it that people feel is missing in the market? And welcome for our listeners, where are, as we talk, where are the areas that you wish there was accessible, training, where you're all busy, you got lives, you got personal lives, you got everything going on at your organization. You don't have an unlimited amount of time. There are areas where you need to know more to do your job better, to grow, to anticipate what's coming. What's missing today? There are obviously great training programs out there. We love the IAPP's training programs. Jason Kronk does interesting training. University of Maastricht. There's so many others that people can mention. And please do mention if there's a training you took that's super worthwhile that you think others should do. I've done a number of real great online AI training. I do admit that it starts to get very technical, but that's fine. I took the first few hours, I learned what I needed. One of the things that we're trying to do is not be too technical, but be technical enough that you know what you need to know. So, Alyssa, you have started by interviewing and talking to lots of senior people about what they want, what's missing, where senior chief privacy officers or others see a need. What are the areas where you've heard a lot of interest and demand?
Yeah, thanks, Jules. I did do that. I had a number of phone calls with FPF members, and really one of the top topics that they brought up was AI. We heard a lot about the EU AI Act, looking about and thinking about the compliance with that. Ad tech still remains at the top of the list, I would say. And it's everything from an ad tech 101. Then I heard a little bit about a 201, but then I also heard, how about bringing that a little bit further into a deeper dive, a 301. And so that's, certainly something that we are considering and looking into to continue to build out kind of that learner pathway. Biometrics and de-identification still remain very important topics as well. So I'd be very interested to hear what those on the call are thinking about. That's what I heard.
Well, let's talk about the AI component for a second. Obviously, the EU AI Act, as you mentioned, a lot of complexity, a lot of new areas. There are conformity assessments, right? People who've worked in data protection probably haven't dealt with that, although that's something that exists in product liability and other areas. And it's just going to be a big, detailed, very wide scope, document. So I think no surprise that people are going to want to make sure that they're up to speed and that their teams are up to speed. But I guess, the underlying technology as well. I remember once upon a time we were talking about big data. Well, what's different here? Big data was going to be used in ways that were surprising, maybe would have bias, maybe could be discriminatory. What uniquely, right, becomes more complicated, more risky, more worrisome when we see, not just large amounts of data, but the machine learning concepts and people being able to unpack, the difference between using algorithms and supervised learning and unsupervised learning and neural networks, and some of the challenges of transparency. Clearly you can't do a serious job here at beginning to understand the AI Act, or frankly some of the state requirements for assessments. New York City has a law that requires a public audit and other types of assessments if you use AI in hiring. Simply knowing whether or not what you do is captured is going to require some degree of underlying technology. It's been really interesting as I've dived deep to learn how much AI is not AI, that it's like a complicated set of rules, which, if you see A, then do B. And sometimes it's pretty simple. It just ends up being lots and lots of rules and a lot of complexity. But it's really just a lot of rules like we had in the past, right? If the user types in this, you get that. It's just there's 10,000, options, as opposed to feed the thing data and somehow it then knows how to write poems and and write term papers. And there isn't necessarily, an algorithm that says, well, if it's a math term paper, here's the different things, that you can do. So I think we're seeing some legal teach us the law, but as much teach us the underlying technologies that are needed. Question from somebody in the audience here. A challenge that I'm facing. I know what I think companies need to learn, but I don't necessarily know what they're looking for except basic compliance training. I still haven't figured out that sweet spot. So, okay, so this sounds like this is somebody interested in, offering training and wants to understand what more broadly companies are looking for. So the luxury, we've had is we've got 205 or so kind of direct member, organizations, as well as we just deal with a huge swath of, organizations dealing with data. And so we ask, and it's pretty broad. So Alyssa says EU AI Act is going to be a big driver. I think that's pretty obvious from all the regulation that's coming. I'd say more broadly, we see these requirements for assessments, for audits, for risk, assessments, whether it's NIST or whether it's obligations around automated decisioning. And there's still a lot of uncertainty about how to do that, but there's a lot of expertise out there about how to do that. Another area Alyssa mentioned was ad tech, and everybody. There's a well-known analyst in the space called Eric Seufert. Mobile Devmo is his website. He's an investor, an analyst, and commentator. Has lots of opinions. And he some time ago said everything is an ad network and what he meant by that was that it used to be you dealt with ad tech, but you were a retailer, you were a ride-sharing app, you were a delivery service, you were whatever. But today, many publishers who we don't think of as publishers, not news media, Walgreens is an ad network, Walmart is an ad network, Amazon is obviously a huge ad network, ride-sharing companies, like anybody who has a significant number of users is increasingly saying, I want to be in the advertising market. So there's a lot of folks for whom it's new. Maybe they obviously dealt with it, they advertised, but they weren't themselves hosting ads. So we're seeing a lot of people wanting to understand, and we see a lot of lawsuits about cookies as wiretapping. We see European focus on the right kinds of legal basis. We see lots of technical questions. We see people being sued for leaking data using ad tags or relationships with social media where they're surprised at what they're sending, and they shouldn't be surprised because it's visible to critics to see. It's visible to anyone to see. How do you not see it, right? Well, people aren't comfortable initially running the tools. So we've always seen a lot of interest in how does a web page get assembled, where and how does third-party, information or data end up being removed or embedded or transferred via, URLs or ad tags, IP addresses. What are they? How are they logged? When are they used? What is necessary? What are the ad-related uses? Right? It's a whole range of just help me understand. It's a little bit of basic internet architecture, but it's specifically the way different third parties are often connected. And so if you're assessing whether or not there's a sale under California, understanding, where and what data goes, what's sensitive, what's personal. Level 2, we start dealing with more complexities around mobile, around TV, around some of the more complicated third parties, clean rooms, and the different bidding systems. We haven't created a 3.0 yet. Interesting to hear that there's some demand for that. I assume some of that interest probably will be clean rooms. That's a big focus for us. I think a lot of people are confused. A lot of the clean rooms are not super transparent about how they work, and they claim to do all kinds of sophisticated technology. But if you're going to have to decide whether or not you're working with data with a partner and having a clean room involved, successfully minimizes sharing, but yet preserves the utility of what you're trying to do, you really need to understand what those folks are doing. So you mentioned ads, you mentioned AI, you mentioned biometrics. Say a bit more about that. Why are people interested in biometrics? Has it got to do with these giant lawsuits that we hear around facial recognition and other types of activity?
I was just going to say, yeah, I absolutely think it is that. It is around the facial recognition. We have a biometrics course that we are actually going to be doing a class on in June, and so I think you're just gonna. It's something that's been important. It's continues to be out there. It's it's an important topic. It's everywhere, right? It's the ubiquity of it. So
BIPA obviously, and the multi-billion-dollar threat is obviously creating an issue. Lots of new state laws. At the same time, more and more organizations, right? We're all swiping our fingers and our faces to access our phones and access workspaces, and with some of the new technologies, biometrics, XR and VR, right? You're talking about wearing things on your body that learn things about you, your eye. We did some work around eye tracking. Cars are increasingly aware of the occupant, whether you're looking off the road, right? In large part, people sometimes want to know whether what they're doing is a biometric or not, and that's not always so clear, right? Counting the number of heads in a space, or again, what if many vehicles can determine that you've looked away from the road, maybe kid in the back seat, changing the radio, opening up your Chinese food that you're going to eat while you're driving. That's unfortunately me, and will alert that you've looked away. But is it a biometric, right? Has it recorded unique user level data? So parsing exactly when and where, and not all of those laws are drafted in a way that purely reflects, or even face recognition, right? I mean, there's a big difference between picking someone out of a crowd because you have a database of all faces and this face is authorized to enter this phone. I may or may not have your identity, behind it. I just know this face. I think this is before you started, but we have a smart mirror here that we got when we were investigating some of these interesting items, and the staff took a cutout of Senior Vice President for Policy John Verdi. They put a cutout of his face and they put it on a stick, and that's the face that you need to show to unlock this, right? So it's not John, and it's not John getting in it, but it's just mapping against the face, right? And then letting you in. So there, obviously huge differences. And one of our guests here notes that there are many BIPA-like laws that are being considered by other states. And so,
yeah, that I was going to say that too. Just like keeping all of that in check, right? There's just different nuances for all of the different laws. So it's it's a pretty complex area for sure.
And then you mentioned de-identification. And this is one I think that law and policy people have often been a little bit uncomfortable with, because it gets into kind of statistics pretty quickly. It gets into, we end up obsessing with the definition, reasonably related to an individual, this and that. And the techniques that might be used, whether it's a technique that meets a differential privacy standard where I'm adding noise, and the laws haven't been well crafted in terms of recognition that in many ways the identification is a spectrum. I can guess if I have some basic information whether or not someone's in a database randomly, simply by knowing that some very limited information. When does the risk that my guess is not a wild and random guess, when does that guess start becoming an accurate enough guess that I have some probability that you're in a database? When does that trigger that, oh, now this is personal or not, right? Laws are often not sort of drafted in that way, but when you talk to de-identification experts, they'll walk you through, okay, here's how you assess whether or not a data is personal. Are there unique identifiers? Are there pseudonymous type identifiers, secondary things that are not perhaps an identifier, but that can be used either to reference outside data or even to reference data within the data set? Are there other data sets? How do you go ahead and do an assessment of whether or not there are other data sets available? This is not the day-to-day of kind of privacy lawyers, but yet you can't just hand it over to a technologist, because they can have a lot of questions, right? How much noise do I need to add? Here's a data set. We're obligated to release it. Maybe we're obligated to share it. We want to study. We've aggregated it. But what are the things we need to do to ascertain whether we've created a risk? It gets very technical, very statistical. So that's one of the reasons why I think we hear a lot of interest like that. Alyssa, you also, I know, heard people want credit for the work they do, certifications, initials after their name, but there's a lot of nuance around that. What have you learned?
Yeah, for sure. I think that, right, there's varying levels that people go through as they do some additional training and education. As you mentioned, there's IAPP, which has full path to certification on many things. There's many other organizations that have training. But what we know that as people are gaining these extra skills, kind of doing a deeper dive, they want to be able to show and share that they have an increased knowledge in a specific area. And I think that, some of these topics that we've been discussing today, kind of sit a little bit outside of that general kind of broad privacy part. And they're a deeper dive into these niche topics, which allow them to say, I have an area of expertise after I've gone through some of these trainings, and they want to share that. And whether that's letting clients know about it, whether that's internally for sharing amongst their team or their employers, I think that that's a really relevant piece of it. So,
Yeah, interestingly, I think um, different strokes for different folks, right? So, if I'm a senior partner at a major law firm and I've been litigating for 20 years, the initials after my name may not be as important as, hey, I handled the SolarWinds data breach. I handled, this number of Fortune, 100 data breaches. I handled the biggest, data breach, as opposed to maybe a certification or a training. You've got some, chops to show. But for the more junior people, maybe applying for your first job and you don't have any privacy experience on your resume. All right. So being able to show that you've, done a course, took a test, you have some base level of knowledge is super valuable. If you've worked to do some training about other regions and so forth, being able to sort of demonstrate that. I'm seeing very senior people, some of the old timers like me, they may be less interested in a particular credential, but they're taking training in adjacent areas, right? They've worked in privacy 20 years. They don't feel necessarily need, more privacy training. They can read, they can spend time. They've got resources and outside counsel and so forth. They've done their CIPP stuff and all that. But they want AI expertise. They want to show ethics expertise. They might want business related training, strategy and data science. And so, we see some of them taking executive MBAs. We see some of them taking privacy engineering training. Lori Craner and Norman Sadeh have a great program at Carnegie Mellon. And so they're doing more academic. This is typically more expensive, and you're getting the credential is the brand name of the important university. So they're getting that. But what they really want is sort of adjacent. It's they're not going to learn it in the course of their work, but they see that to be a senior leader, they need to have the sophistication in business, in AI, in technology related areas, in ethics. A lot of the data protection people have sort of embraced ethics, but like ethics have been studied, and there are schools of learning and thought that are not as easy to jump into if you haven't been a philosophy major or you don't have sort of background. And so having some more rigorous training of what is it that the study of ethics actually means, and how do you bridge that over? And it's not easy reading. I've spent some time reading some of the ethics work, and it's not structured the same way. And I was like, well, how does this fit in? But you spend enough time, you start making those bridging connections, and by now there are obviously lots of scholars who've been doing that bridging. Anything surprise you as you've been talking to folks? You've been working in training a long time. You've built programs, but now that you sort of spent the kind of concerted amount of time, reaching out and anything surprising that struck you?
No, I mean, I think that the conversations I had were absolutely amazing conversations, and I certainly gained a lot of understanding. I think that the quest for continuing education or continual education is there, and it doesn't matter kind of what level you're at, right? It's people in the most senior positions are still wanting to learn what they can. This is such a dynamic and evolving industry that we're in, and it keeps going. And so how can they, as you just had mentioned, we're seeing right now, does AI sit within privacy? And so, hey, let me take some courses. Let me gain a better understanding, bigger, broader about that. And it doesn't stop, it doesn't matter kind of where you are in your professional career. I think that's a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah. What surprised me? Clearly, serious training takes a certain amount of time, a long course, a detailed course. I've been surprised at how many people want shorter, deep, but shorter stuff. And that's because they want things for their HR department, their marketing, their sales. These people are not going to become privacy experts. They don't want to be. They're not going to give that amount of time. But yet they need to know enough to know when to ask, when to spot an issue. And so it was interesting to hear, because we were initially talking sometimes about, day long, multi-day, 2 hours. And some people are like, I can get an hour at their monthly staff meeting. And yeah, I could come in, but it'd be a lot of work for me to put that together. And it's not my core expertise. So a really great module that's like, hello, HR person, hello, salesperson. Here is a lightning tour of the key issues, how to find more data, how to find more information about it, and how it works. So a lot of demand for smaller courses. Obviously, we want more. There's a lot of knowledge to take, but there are also a lot of folks who just are not going to be able to get on the agenda a bigger dive, but want to be able to make that kind of training available, whether it's engineering or sales or many other areas. That was interesting. We were on a call together this week where someone said, I need a 10-minute training. And at first I was a little bit shocked because I was like, well, first of all, it takes me 10 minutes to open my mouth. But I'm like, what could you do in 10 minutes? And I realized, well, they were dealing with a kind of far-flung audience that, didn't see privacy as a big part of their jobs and needed what was perhaps going to be as motivational as educational for why it mattered, to them. But it couldn't be just a lecture. You should care about this, right? They needed to. There's a smart audience, right? They needed some education that would help them understand why, given their sector, this was needed. And so I'm kind of left with like, well, that's a big challenge. But you know what? You're in the elevator with your CEO, and they say to you, "Hey, what's going on with privacy? That's what you handle." You got 10 minutes to, right? Or you're presenting at a board meeting. You may not get an hour. You do need to give. So that was interesting. The demand for high quality stuff that might be good for a smart senior non-privacy expert audience, but people who need to, given that the rules about data are so critical to whether or not you can do that business or whether the data can be used in that way, understanding that envelope and it not just being, I'll ask my expert advisor for a mysterious, Obi-Wan Kenobi answer. You can, you cannot. No, like they wanted strategic information. That was sort of surprising.
Yeah, I think, and right, there's such a push and pull on people's time that I just don't think that if they have a little bit of time, what can I do? What's a snippet that I can get in, learn something and kind of move on. It's a lot if you're looking at more than that a day, things like that. So absolutely.
Folks, wanted to give you just a little bit of a flavor of a much deeper and longer conversation. Yes, we are interested in your interest in training. Go please take a look at our website where you can see the trainings that Alyssa has organized with some of our experts or some key, partners who we think have the knowledge. I've joined many of these classes over the past couple of years. I'm proud of them. I think they're pretty good. Almost everybody will learn something from them. And if you have ideas for others that you think you would like to see us provide, and again, great training out there. It was great to have Jason Kronk with us briefly here. The IAPP trainings, the Maastricht U trainings, all places that I'm fans of. But I think our community is a learning community. It's unique. We can't stop learning. There's so much happening. It's developing and changing so fast. If you aren't learning, you're not keeping up with your own area, let alone all of the converging areas that seem to be impacting the scope of these roles. So thanks for kicking off our training, and please folks do check it out. We'd love to have you in some of these courses. Alyssa, thanks for chatting with me today, and happy Friday, all of you.
Thanks, Jules.